People on the Frontier, Chapter 2, First Part. The year is AD 12,090, and the human race dwells in a world of darkness. Or perhaps it might be more accurate to call it a dark age propped up by science. All 7 continents are crisscrossed by a web of superspeed highways, and at the center of the system sits a fully automated cyber city known as the capital, the product of cutting-edge scientific technology. The dozen weather controllers manipulate the climate freely. Interstellar travel is no longer a far-fetched dream. In vast spaceports, hawking matter conversion rockets and ships propelled by galactic energy stare up at the Empyrean Vault, and exploration parties have actually left their footprints on a number of planets outside our solar system. Altair and Spica, to name just 2. However, all of that is a dream now. Take a peek at the Grand Capital. A fine dust coats the walls of buildings and minarets constructed from translucent metal crystal. In places you'll find recent craters, large and small, from explosives and ultra-heat rays. The majority of automated roads and maglev highways are in shambles, and not a single car remains to zip from place to place like a shooting star. And there are people, tremendous mobs of them, flooding down the streets in endless numbers, laughing, shouting, weeping, paying their respects to the capital, and the melting pot of existence. With a vitality that borders on complete chaos. But their garb isn't what you'd expect for the masters of a once proud metropolis. Men don shabby trousers and tunics redolent of the distant Middle Ages, and threadbare cassocks, like a member of a religious order might wear. Women dress in dim shades, and wear fabric rough to the touch, completely devoid of flamboyance. Through the milling crowd of men armed with long swords or bows and arrows comes a gasoline-powered car, most likely taken from some museum. Trailing black smoke and popping with the firecrackers of backfires, the vehicle carries along a group of laser gun-toting lawmen. A dreadful scream rises from one of the buildings and a woman staggers out. From her inhuman cry, people instinctively know the cause of her terror, and call out for the sheriff and his men. Before long, they race to the scene, ask the wailing woman where the terror is located, and enter the building in question, with faces paler than the bloodless countenance of the witness herself. They ride an independently powered elevator down 500 stories. In one of the subterranean passageways, all of which had supposedly been destroyed ages ago, there's a concealed door, and beyond it a vast graveyard where the nobility, blood-craving creatures of the night, slumber as in days gone by in wooden coffins filled with damp soil. The sheriff and his men soon go into action. Fortunately, it seems there are no curses or vicious beasts here. No defense system of lasers or electronic cannons. These nobles were probably resigned to their fate. The lawmen hold rough wooden stakes and gleaming metal hammers in their hands. Their expressions are a pallid blend of fear and sinfulness. The mob of black silhouettes encircles a coffin. Someone's arm rises toward the heavens, then knifes back down. There's a dull thud. A horrifying scream and the stench of blood fill the graveyard. The anguished cry grows thinner and dies out, and the group moves on to the next coffin. When the lawmen leave the graveyard not long after that, their faces are adorned with crimson beads of blood, and a shade of sinfulness much deeper than the one they wore before this mission. Though the nobility was nearly extinct, the feelings of pride brought on by the awe humanity held toward them had seeped into their very blood over the course of 10 long millennia, and would not be shaken off so easily. And because they had indeed reigned supreme over the human race, and because the automated city, now populated by people who couldn't fathom its machinery or receive the tiniest fraction of the benefits it might provide, and everything else in the world that could be called civilization was something they had left behind. They, the vampires. This strict stratification of vampires and humanity came about when one day in 1999, mankind's history as lords of the earth came to an abrupt end. Someone pushed the button and launched the full-scale nuclear war that the human race had been warned about for so long. Thousands of ICBMs and MIRVs flew in disarray, reducing one major city after another to a white-hot inferno. But the immediate fatalities were far outstripped by the wholesale death dealt by radiation more potent than tens of thousands of X-rays. The theory of a limited nuclear war, where sensible battles would be fought so the winners might later rebuild and rule, was obliterated in a split second by 1,000,000 degrees of heat and flame. The survivors barely made it, their numbers totally insignificant. They shunned the surface world and its toxic atmosphere, and were left with no choice but to live in underground shelters for the next few years. When they finally returned to the surface, their mechanized civilization was in ruins. With no way of contacting other survivors in other countries, any thoughts these isolated pockets of humanity might have had of things returning to the way they'd been before the destruction, or even of rebuilding to the point where it could be called a civilization, were flights of fantasy, and nothing more. The regression began, with generation after generation striving merely to survive. Memories of the past grew dim. The population increased somewhat after 1,000 years, but civilization itself plunged back to the level of the Middle Ages. Dreading the mutant creatures spawned by radiation and cosmic rays, the humans formed small groups and moved into plains and forests that over the years had gradually returned to verdure. In their struggles with the cruel environment, at times they had to kill their newborn babies to keep what little food they had. Other times, the infants went toward filling their parents' empty bellies. That was the time. In that pitch-black, superstitious world they appeared. How they, the vampires, kept themselves hidden from the eyes of man and lived on in luxuriant shadows was unclear. However, their life form was almost exactly as described in legend, and they seemed the best suited to fill the role of the new masters of history. Ageless and undying so long as they partook of the blood of other creatures, the vampires remembered a civilization the human race could not, and they knew exactly how to rebuild it. Before the nuclear war, the vampires had contacted others of their kind who lurked in dark places around the globe. And they had a hidden superpower source that they'd secretly developed in fallout shelters of their own design, along with the absolute minimum machinery required to reconstruct civilization after the absolute worst came to pass. But that's not to say they were the ones who caused the nuclear war. Through cryptesthesia, the black arts, and psychic abilities mankind never guessed they'd cultivated, the vampires simply knew when the human race would destroy itself, and how they, the vampires, could restore order to the world. Civilization was rebuilt and the tables were turned for vampires and humans. How much friction and discord that course created between the two sides was soon apparent. Within 2,000 years of stepping onto history's great stage, the vampires gave the world a sprawling civilization driven by super science and sorcery, and dubbed themselves the nobility, and subjugated humanity. The automated city with its electronic brain and ghostly will, interstellar spaceships, weather controllers, methods of creating endless quantities of materials through matter conversion. All this came into being through the thoughts and deeds of them and them alone. However, who could have imagined that within 5 short millennia of this golden age, they would be treading the road to extinction? History didn't belong to them after all. As a species, the vampires possessed an underlying spark to live that was far less tenacious than that of humans. Or perhaps it would be better to say that their life held an element that ensured their future destruction. From the end of the 4th millennia AD, the vampire civilization as a whole started to show a phenomenal decline in energy. And that brought on the start of mankind's great rebellion. Though they had an expertise in the physiology of the human brain, and had developed the science of psychology to such extremes they could manipulate the human mind in any way they chose, in the end they found it impossible to eradicate the innate urge to rebel that lurked in the depths of the human soul. Weakened by one great uprising after another, the nobility entered dozens of armistices with the humans, each of which maintained the peace for short periods. But before long, the nobles faded away, like gallant nihilists who realized their destiny. Some took their own lives, while others entered a sleep that would last until the end of time. Some even headed off into the depths of space, but their numbers were extremely few. In general, the vampires had no wish to establish themselves in extraterrestrial environs. At any rate, their overall numbers were on the decline. Ultimately, they scattered before mankind's pursuit. By the time AD 12,090 arrived, the vampires served no purpose beyond terrorizing the humans on the frontier. Yet, precisely because this was their sole purpose, the humans felt a special terror of them that shook their very souls. To be honest, it was miraculous that mankind was able to plan and execute a rebellion no matter how utterly desperate they might have been. The horror all felt for vampires, who slept by day and awoke at night to suck the lifeblood from humans and ensure their own eternal life, became part of the vampire mythology, right along with the ancient legends of transformations into bats and wolves, and their power to control the elements. As a result of clever psychological manipulation that continued throughout this mechanized age, the horror laid roots down into the deepest layers of the human psyche. It is said that the first time the humans signed an armistice with the vampires, their rulers, all the representatives on the human side save one were shaking so badly their teeth chattered. Even though vampires could no longer be found in the capital, it had still taken the humans nearly 300 years to check every street and building. And given how much strength the vampires had in their favor, why hadn't they set about exterminating the human race? That is the eternal question. It couldn't be that they were simply afraid of destroying their source of blood, since they had mastered a method of perfectly synthesizing human blood in the first stage of their civilization. As far as manual labor went, They had more than enough robots to bear the load by the time the revolution broke out. In fact, the reason why they allowed humans to continue to exist in the first place, even in their role as subordinates, is a mystery. Most likely was due to some sort of superiority complex, or out of pity. Vampires were rarely seen by humans anymore, but the fear remained. On very rare occasions, they appeared from the depths of the darkness and left their vile bite on the pale throats of their victims. Sometimes a person would seek them out with a wooden stake in hand like a man possessed, while at other times the humans would drive the victim out from their midst, earnestly praying they wouldn't receive another visit from the vampires. The hunters were a product of the people's fear. Being nearly indestructible themselves, the vampires weren't so eager to exterminate the mutant creatures humanity feared so much in the years just after the war. Quite the contrary, the vampires loved the vicious beasts, nurtured them, and even created others like them with their own hands. Thanks to their unparalleled knowledge of biology and genetic engineering, the vampires unleashed one legendary monster after another into the world of man. Werewolves were tigers, serpent men, golems, fairies, mer-creatures, goblins, raksas, ghouls, zombies, banshees, fire dragons, salamanders resistant to flames, griffins, krakens, and more. Though their creators neared extinction, the creatures still ran rampant on the plains and in the mountains, working the land of the scant machinery the nobility allowed them, defending themselves with replicas of old-fashioned gunpowder weapons or homemade swords and spears. The humans studied the nature of these artificial monstrosities for generations, learning their powers and their weaknesses. In time, some people came to work exclusively on weapons and ways to kill these things. Of those people, some specialized in producing more effective weaponry, while those of surpassing strength and agility trained themselves to use those weapons. These exceptional warriors were the first hunters. As time went by, hunters became more narrowly focused, and specialists like the were-tiger hunter and fairy hunter were born. Of them all, vampire hunters were universally recognized as possessing strength and intellect beyond the rest, as well as an ironclad will impervious to the fear their former rulers inspired in others. First part, end.